before we do that, I will turn it over to our colleague Anil Mundra, who is at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And the title of his presentation is Jain Engagements with Hindus and Others Through Study, Haribhadrasūri and the Compendium of Current Teachings. So Professor Mundra, over to you, and then we'll have a wider discussion with all of us.
Thank you all very, very much. I am sharing my slides. Can you see my title slide? Okay,
Yes,
great.
indeed.
Okay, so I am going to look in some detail at how anekāntavāda was engaged by one of its most important and I think influential theorists, the great Śvetāmbara Haribhadrasūri. Going to see how comparative theology is a label that fits well with what Haribhadrasūri is doing, but comparative philosophy as was also mentioned as a possibility, and that I think that would also be appropriate. In general, what Haribhadra is doing is engaging with a range of views which can be aptly characterized as religious, and some of which are also aptly characterized as theological. And those theological ones are the ones that I am going to highlight in my short time today. So one thing that we'll see is that anekāntavāda is not the only way he engages with a religious difference. And in fact, as Dr. Miller and Dr. Barbero alluded to earlier, anekāntavāda isn't itself only used to do comparison. It has a variety of uses, metaphysical and methodological and apologetical and defensive and maybe even sociological. But I'm going to try to show today how these various uses can overlap and converge in a project of engaging a diversity of religious teachings. So one of the places, maybe the place where Haribhadra engages anekāntavāda most intensively with religious diversity is in the Compendium of Current Teachings, the Śāstravārttāsamuccaya. So now here's what he says is his project in the compendium. When one hears the Compendium of Current Teachings, one ascertains the general principles in all the teachings. This ascertainment pacifies hate and brings the pleasure of the attainment of heaven. Grief comes from evil, happiness from righteousness. This is the conclusion in all the teachings. So this sounds a little like that thing about, all religions being true or equivalent, or facing difference, maybe that, Dr. Mehta warned us about against earlier, a few minutes ago, right? And this is not saying, by the way, this is not really doing anekāntavāda yet. This is not saying that each is true sort of from their own perspectives. This isn't differentiating perspectives. It seems to be saying that there's really just a single perspective that all of the different teachings reduce to. So he next lists some truths of ethics and spirituality that are indeed fairly uncontroversial in classical Indian religions. He talks about the importance of friendliness, unselfishness, devotion to worthy objects, the transience of attachments, youth, and the transience of life itself, and ultimately the unsatisfactoriness of samsara, the round of worldly existence and rebirth, and the desirability of liberation from it, right? So this may sound a little bit like the sort of potentially problematic use of comparison that Professor Mehta mentioned, to sort of exclusively emphasize similarity and ignore difference. But that's just the preamble. That's just the first 5% or so of the treatise. And he ends up not by saying that they're all right, all the teachings are right. So he goes on at the end of the preamble. He says, now, however, we summarily discuss which teachings are right by consistently rebutting bad philosophical reasoning and false explanations. And so the rest of the 700-verse treatise is concerned with elaborating and adjudicating differences between the different religious philosophical teachings. But he's not only rejecting them either, no more than he's only accepting them. And this is where anekāntavāda comes in. He is going to distinguish the respects in which different teachings are right and the ones in which they're not, the respects in which they're not right. So he looks at a whole bunch of different views. First one he addresses is atheistic materialism, which is actually, I mean, and standardly for an Indian philosopher, this is the only one that he does entirely reject, is this atheistic materialism, Lokayata Charvaka um, philosophy. There are others. There are other, but all of the rest of the views that he addresses are varieties of what we call Hinduism and Buddhism. And since I don't have time to review all of them, and this panel is about Hinduism, I'm just going to focus on a few of those. So most of what we think of as Hinduism involves some sort of commitment to some sort of God. Most I say, and I will come back to that important hedge. But usually, but the kind of God that is the word that's often used for some sort of God in Hinduism is Ishvara in Sanskrit, so there, as I said, there are exceptions of that to that this view, a belief in Ishvara, and I'm going to come to those. And there are also a variety of Hindu ways of conceiving Ishvara. So here's Haribhadra's pass at one Hindu notion of Ishvara. He says, God, Ishvara, is here considered by other sages a creator, insofar as he is the inciter with an inconceivably powerful intelligence and eternally pure. He is the ruler of the universe whose tetrad of knowledge, desirelessness, masterfulness, and virtue are unimpeded and intrinsic. Ignorant creatures, powerless with respect to their own joy or sorrow, shall be sent by God to heaven or to hell. That last line actually comes from Mahabharata and is found also in the commentaries and treatises of several classical philosopher theologians that we would now characterize as Hindu. So the picture here is of an all-powerful controller God who determines the destinies of his creatures. And so Haribhadra immediately here raises the typical Jain objections to such a picture. And these are the sorts of objections, right? And the fact that they're characteristic of Jain thinkers, that, make it a little questionable to talk about theology at all with respect to Jainism, as Professor Barbara said. And this is, in fact, these objections are what have made a lot of people throughout history, both in India and outside, want to call Jains atheists, which Jains never agree to, by the way, generally, traditionally. So here are some of the objections, typical Jain objections to this view of Ishvara. How does such divine agency make sense, since it should be devoid of passion? That is, this divine agency should be devoid of passion and so lack any motive for action. God straightaway incites some creatures to actions resulting in hell, some to actions leading to heaven, and so on. For what reason? And if beings operate on their own, given their variations of karma, why tout God's pointless agency here? That is, if it's karma that's causing creatures to act and not Ishvara, then what are you talking about when you talk about God having agency, Ishvara having agency? So, the view in the background here, right, is the typical Jain view is that any being worthy of worship will be a model of the dispassionate transcendence of worldly vicissitudes, right? That is, in other words, a jinnah, or at least a siddha, right? And in his view, in Haribhadra's view, this precludes God's literally doing anything. If God is worthy of worship at all, why would God do anything from creating the universe to helping some people and hurting others? So those are Haribhadra's objections to a certain kind of theism, a certain view of Ishvara. And yet, despite these objections, Haribhadra again labors to affirm theism in some qualified way, rather than rejecting it outright on the basis of his criticism. So he declares that this doctrine of God's agency is actually proper, since people of pure intellect pronounce it without contradicting proper logic. That is, he takes it that there are some really smart and pure-minded theists who are propounding this doctrine according to good rules of reasoning. And so he wants to give these theists the benefit of the doubt. So he says the great-souled authors of the scriptural teachings were generally free from desire for existence. Committed to the welfare of beings, why would they say unreasonable things? So one wanting to benefit should therefore properly search their intention by non-contradiction with scriptural teachings and logic. That's what a thinking person does. So Haribhadra is saying that we should presume good intentions, even for scriptures that seem to disagree with oneself. If you want the benefit of their teachings, then you have to give their teachings the most fruitful possible readings according to your own commitments. And that means that Jains should interpret the theist's belief in an agent of God, that is a God that is an agent in the world, in the following way. God is indeed the supreme soul, the Paramatman, because liberation comes from resorting to the rule he proclaims. Therefore, God is called an agent of liberation in a secondary sense. Since the continual round of existence, that is samsara, in fact comes from not resorting to his rule, it's not wrong to imagine God's agency for liberation as well. Because God teaches you how to be liberated and how to get out of samsara. Since the statement, he is an agent, is how some people make homage, this is where the teaching of his agency comes from. One is considered, sorry, this is a typo, one is considered God due to endowment with supreme glory. The doctrine of divine agency is thus established as faultless. So, despite Haribhadra's objections to the idea of an agentive God, he's allowing here that we can figuratively call God an agent of liberation. And so, in this way, while Haribhadra has not shied away from criticizing theistic views, he's also again willing to grant traditional teachers the benefit of the doubt and interpret their teachings as tenably as possible. So he concludes this section by approvingly quoting the laws of Manu, when it says that one who inspects the Vedas and the Dharma Shastra in concord with the Vedas and teachings, the Shastras, knows righteousness. He's willing to countenance the legitimacy of non-Jain teachers and scriptures and interpret them charitably as part of his substantive theological interventions. So here we see two interpretive methods converge. One is anekāntavāda, that is nuancing our interpretation of what a given proposition means in order to consistently affirm what appear to be sort of opposed ideas and opposed understandings of a given doctrine. God is an agent and God is not an agent. Nuancing the interpretation of statements like that in order to be able to affirm both sides. And then the other thing is a certain kind of interpretive charity, the presumption that your interlocutor is reasonable and even possibly right. Okay, so now, as I mentioned, of course, not all Hindus are or were in Haribhadra's time exactly theists. And so, although the title of this panel is Jainism in Dialogue with Hinduism, there was the question that Jessica Zhu posed in the first session about whether, isms are really a helpful unit of analysis in comparison. And indeed, Haribhadra doesn't talk about Hindus. After all, no one in his time did. He addresses various views, and as we'll see, he actually intervenes in disputes between various kinds of Hindus. So among Sankhya philosophers, for example, there were those who believed in the Ishvara and those who didn't. And but one thing that all of the Sankhyas agreed about was that they all endorsed a dualism between prakriti, sort of active nature, and on the other hand, the pure awareness of the person, Purusha, who doesn't engage in any action at all. So if only nature is active, the person simply witnesses this activity without being involved in it. That's a basic Sankhya doctrine. But then that would mean, in Haribhadra's reading, that oneself, Atman, is never bound or liberated if it's the primeval nature, Prakriti, that is bound and liberated on its own. And that would fly, Haribhadra thinks, that would fly in the face of the traditional notions of karmic bondage and liberation that he opened with, right? So Haribhadra goes on to say, in their doctrine, the ancients have said that liberation arises for the person. And that wouldn't make sense if this dualism is the case. So it's completely unreasonable, this Sankhya dualism. But now again, rather than entirely abandon the Sankhyas, Haribhadra adopts their terminology and works to rectify it. So he goes on to say, here other philosophers, according to sound logic, consider the person to obtain liberation in nature just to be karmic nature. That is, they consider the person who obtains, the Purusha who obtains, They consider that it's the person who's obtaining liberation and that it's nature, prakriti, that is just karmic nature. And since nature, prakriti, is multiform, through its connection with transformation and because of binding the self, the aforementioned faults do not arise. That is to say, the problems that the person would never be bound or liberated, which arise from an absolute dualism, don't arise if you nuance that dualism. Jains are also dualists, but they're not one-sidedly dualists. Most Jains consider matter and karma to enter into some sort of real relation with the conscious self that accounts for the bondage and liberation of the self. It's that real relation between nature and the self that binds and ultimately getting rid of which unbinds the self. So Haribhadra therefore translates Sankhya terms into closely adjacent Jain ones to give their view a tenable reading. Nature is karma, and the person is the self. So his conclusion is that in this way, the doctrine of intrinsic nature should also be considered to be truth indeed, since it's taught by the divine Sankhya Guru Kapila, who is a great sage. So this should now be a familiar refrain. Haribhadra evaluates and validates other teachers by means of both philosophical criticism, grounded in anekāntavāda, and also charitable interpretation or reinterpretation. Now, of course, in rejecting an absolute dualism, Haribhadra isn't endorsing an absolute non-dualism either. That would just be another extreme that he wants to eschew. And as I said, Jains are dualists of a certain sort. So, for example, Advaita Vedanta, a non-dual reading of the Upanishads that was ascendant in this period, posited that everything is simply the one cosmic principle of Brahman, that there's in fact nothing else but Brahman, there's no differences at all. And that poses a problem for the Jain path because it eliminates the resources to discriminate anything from anything else, including discriminating even bondage from liberation. How do you even make sense of being liberated from bondage if liberation and bondage are the same? So here, although Haribhadra resolutely insists that this doctrine is wrong, this non-dualist doctrine is wrong, he again takes a different tack of interpretive charity, but this is different from what we saw before. It's a more pragmatic approach. He says that this doctrine may be useful for cultivating certain soteriologically important states of mind. So he says, others explain that the non-dual teaching is taught in the scriptures in order to establish equanimity, not in truth. And this is not defeated by reason, since it's grounded in the true scriptural teachings and so on, because of the existence of the round of existence and liberation from it, and because it grounds effort for that goal. Otherwise, if there were truly non-duality between the round of existence and liberation, between samsara and liberation, this would entail the fruitlessness of all practice, and that would be undesirable. So Haribhadra here affirms that non-duality may be spiritually useful even if it's not actually true. This is an interpretive approach that Buddhists made famous as upaya kaushalya, skillful means. So Haribhadra is using here a Buddhist hermeneutic to pragmatically endorse a Hindu idea that is technically in contradiction with standard Jain doctrine. Haribhadra comes back to Vedanta toward the end of his compendium, and this is where I'm going to end. He considers the question of the relationship between knowledge and action. And this is a crucially important question in all Indian philosophies. I mean, arguably in religious life of any kind, it certainly is important, crucial in Jainism, where, two of the three jewels, right, are knowledge, jnana, and action, charitra. And this issue actually drives a wedge between different Hindu philosophical schools. So whereas the Vedanta generally prioritizes the knowledge that's provided by the so-called Jnanakanda of the Vedas, right? That is the Upanishads that explain and speculate about the Vedic ritual and its relation to reality. The Purva Mimamsa school of Hinduism is preoccupied with the ritual actions that are connected to the liturgical portions of the Vedic Samhitas, that is the Karma Kanda. So Haribhadra now intervenes in this internecine dispute between Hindus by attempting to reconcile the two wings, knowledge and action. So he says, some claim that attainment necessarily comes only from knowledge, others that it's from action only, and other clear-sighted people that it's from both. These clear-sighted people, by the way, are of course Jain philosophers who are able to affirm both sides of this dilemma. And this affirmation of both sides is actually the last major claim of Haribhadra's essay. So he says, liberation indeed is born of absolute knowledge and extraordinary action, because the former is present just when the latter is present and absent when the latter is absent. So he's saying that knowledge and action are mutually implicative. They mutually entail each other on the path to liberation. And here's his argument for that. He says, oops, that is the wrong. I'm sorry for my technical ineptitude today. I don't have the argument on a slide, so I'm just going to read it for you. This is where he finishes up. He says, all rewards make sense when there is connection between knowledge and action, and their presence ultimately obtains when those two obtain, not otherwise. If one properly conducts oneself, thoroughly knowing the object to be achieved, then she achieves it indeed. So says Brihaspati. Proper conduct is said to be the means to obtaining what is achieved. If that's not obtained, it doesn't make sense for that conduct to be the means. Proper knowledge does not in any way belong to one who undertakes what's unachievable or to one who doesn't undertake what is to be achieved. So both knowledge and action entail each other. So Haribhadra is arguing for what's pretty much the standard Jain position, that both knowledge and action are required for spiritual attainment. Note that he's not appealing to any particularly Jain reasons for that. His arguments pretty much appeal to common sense, and the only sort of sectarian appeal he mentions this Brihaspati, who serves here as a Hindu source of authority. The upshot, though, is not only a Jain doctrine, but takes a generally non-one-sided form of affirming both sides of a dichotomy. So now this is not a typical anekāntavāda statement, because he's not saying in some respect knowledge gives attainment and in some respect action does, although he probably could say that. But he's actually going further than that, than just saying, oh, well, they're both right in their own way, you know, sort of live and let live, and just leave it at that. Haribhadra is actually making a stronger argument for what underlies anekāntavāda statements like in some way X, in some way not X. The stronger point that each of these sides actually entail each other. Neither makes sense without the other. It's a both-and resolution of false either-or dichotomies, not just by fiat, but rather through a reasoned repudiation of polarization and mutual exclusiveness. So he's constructing a synthesis of both sides together in a mutually implicative relation, such that neither is adequate without the other. And that, I'd say, is the essence of anekāntavāda, here applied to actual disputes between religious philosophical rivals. Thanks. Sorry for my technical difficulties. Michami Dukradam.
No problem, Professor Mundra. Thank you so much for that very clear exposition of Haribhadra's approach to anekāntavāda.